let's talk next about the enforcement provisions of the rule. So essentially, you need to know that anybody can file a complaint for violation of regulations. And if that happens, TDA will investigate and make a report. So this could happen if your neighbor doesn't like what you're doing. They could file a report with TDA, and potentially claim that you're violating TDA rules. Those can come from folks filing complaints, or they could come from a TDA investigation that it undertook itself. Again, TDA will investigate and make a report. Okay, so the real concern here is what happens if a violation occurs. If you're doing something that violates the TDA regulations, it's kind of going to fall into one of two buckets. Either it could be considered a negligent violation, or it could be considered a violation with a culpable mental state higher than negligence. Okay, so let's talk first about a negligent violation. Essentially, a negligent violation is going to be where you did something, you didn't act with intent, but a reasonable person would have known it was a violation. That's kind of the negligence standard, right? What would a reasonable person have known or done under the circumstances? If you commit something that's a negligent violation, you have to have a corrective action plan that you create and put into place. If you get 3 negligent violations in a 5-year period, that's going to result in your license being revoked for 5 years. So that's the real implication of a negligent violation, is if you get 3 of them in a 5-year period, there is that revocation of your license. There is no criminal enforcement for a negligent violation. So that's something I think that makes people maybe breathe a little bit easier when they're looking at potentially producing hemp. If there's something that happens and there's not a culpable state that's higher than negligence, there are no criminal enforcement actions that will be taken. Additionally, the rule sort of includes what's called, I call a safe harbor provision. Basically what it says is if you're growing hemp and your crop tests hot, okay, so if you're above the 0.3% THC level, the rule says it is not going to be considered a negligent violation if you were using reasonable production practices and as long as the crop tests less than 0.5% THC. All right, so essentially the rule is giving you a little bit of grace here and saying, look, if your crop is hot, we're not going to say that it's a negligent violation if you use reasonable production practices and it tests lower than 0.5% THC. That's what's in the current TDA rule. This is another area where the USDA rule changed this a little bit. The USDA rule actually says we're going to increase that safe harbor amount to 1%. So it says even if your crop is testing hot and it's below 1%, as long as you use reasonable production practices, that is not going to be considered a negligent violation. And also, the USDA rule limits the number of negligent violations to 1 per year. So let's say that you did something and you had 3 different lots. You're not going to get 3 negligent violations. It's 1 for that entire growing season. All right. So again, those USDA rules have not been incorporated into the TDA rules at the time of this recording. I would anticipate that TDA sure may do that, but you'll want to keep an eye on it and see if those changes are adopted into the Texas rules as well. The second kind of bucket of violations, right? We've got negligent violations, and then you've got violations with a culpable state greater than negligence. This is going to be violations that are reckless or knowing or intentional. So here, instead of it being, a standard of what would a reasonable person have done, in order to have a culpable mental state higher than negligence, it's going to have to be something where you kind of knew or should have known, or it was really obvious that this was going to almost have to be the result from your actions. So a higher mental state in order to fall into this bucket. And that's really important because if you do act with a mental state higher than negligence, this is where criminal enforcement can come into play. Your actions are going to have to be reported to the state and federal criminal agencies. So if TDA finds out you're doing something, you are acting in a manner that is more culpable than negligence, they have to report that to state and federal law enforcement. And you're subject to not only criminal penalties from those agencies, but also you're subject to license revocation and monetary civil penalties.